The wind moved across the wide western land like an old memory that refused to fade, carrying dust, pine scent, and the distant call of wild horses. The sun had not yet risen high, but the sky was already turning gold behind the tall mountains. Town folks were slowly waking, cattle were being guided toward grazing fields, and the lonely wooden fences cast long morning shadows on the empty dirt road. Somewhere far beyond that dusty road, a young woman rode slowly on a stagecoach, pressing her hand against her chest as her heart beat faster with every mile. She was returning to a land she once swore she would never see again. Her journey was not for adventure or gold or land. She was coming back to marry the cowboy who saved her life when she was young. Even though he had never asked for anything in return, no letter had been exchanged, and no promise had been spoken. Yet she carried one truth inside. She owed her life, her dreams, and her future to the quiet western cowboy she had left behind years ago in her childhood memories. That land had once felt cruel and unforgiving. She remembered riding through snowfields with her family wagon, feeling hungry at times and frightened when storms rolled over the hills. The journey had been long, dangerous, and filled with worry. But what she remembered most was a night when everything changed and her life nearly ended. She had been weak from cold and fever, left behind by accident when her wagon team panicked at the sound of wolves crying through the night. She would not have survived if not for the cowboy who found her near a frozen creek, carried her to his cabin, and cared for her when no one else even knew she was missing. She could still picture him standing by the fire, his hat low, his voice steady, and his silent strength stronger than any weapon. She remembered how he placed his coat around her shoulders and how he stayed awake the entire night, making sure she breathed without struggle. She never forgot those moments, even when life pulled her far away into a world of better clothes, bigger towns, and bigger dreams. Now she was older, stronger, and able to speak without fear, but her heart was not free. She had learned that success, comfort, and social praise do not erase gratitude or buried feelings. She wanted to stand in front of that man again, not as a frightened young girl he saved, but as a woman ready to choose him with her own free will. She hoped he was still somewhere in that wild land, living the same simple life with horses, ranch land, and honest hands. The thought of seeing him again filled her with nervous warmth, but she also feared she had taken too long. What if he had never remembered her? What if he thought she left forever without a thank you? What if he never expected her return, or had given his heart to someone else? Questions pressed into her like sharp thorns, but she pushed forward. Knowing she could no longer hide from fate, the stagecoach wheels creaked loudly as they neared the small western town she once knew only for survival. Wooden shops, a blacksmith, an old church, and a dusty saloon stood just like in old memories. Cowboys leaned on hitch posts, ranch girls walked holding laundry baskets, and horses whinnied as wind blew the dry ground. Nothing seemed to change much, yet everything felt heavier with time. She stepped down from the coach slowly, her boots touching familiar soil. She stayed still for a moment, taking in the smell of hay and chimney smoke. Men on horses looked her way with curiosity because her clothes were clean, neat, and different from the usual ranch attire. She carried a small travel bag, one letter of permission, and a heart full of quiet hope. She asked a shopkeeper if he remembered a silent cowboy who lived near the northern ridge, where the tall pines grew. The older man froze for a second, as if the name she did not speak was living somewhere deep in his memory. He nodded and pointed toward the hills, saying that the man she sought still lived there, alone, and not much had changed. She thanked him and walked toward the path he pointed at, trying to calm her mind. Her breath felt short as she walked away from the voices of town and closer to the quiet land where her past was buried. Every leaf, branch, and breeze seemed to whisper a memory. She did not know if she would be welcomed or ignored, but she stepped on anyway, because walking away would hurt forever. As she climbed through the pine trees and across the rocks, her thoughts moved back to the night he rescued her. She remembered how he wrapped her in a wool blanket and how his eyes showed more care than his words. He never asked who she belonged to or what reward he might get. He simply said, "You are safe," and that was enough. When he later found her family tribe and returned her safely, she wanted to say, "Stay with me," or "Take me with you." But she was too young to understand how hearts speak. Over the years, she carried an invisible promise. She would return when life was in her own control, when she could stand before him as someone who could give, not only receive. Her boots sank into the soft grass as she reached the ridge, and a small wooden cabin appeared behind a line of tall trees. The same cabin that once held warm firelight glowed again, just like she remembered. Smoke climbed gently from the chimney, meaning he was home. She felt her throat tighten and her eyes burn with emotions. She wondered if he would recognize her after all this time, or if her face and voice had changed too much. Part of her wanted to knock on the door quickly, while another part wanted to wait hidden behind the trees and watch him first. She stood in silence, not yet ready to reveal herself. The cabin door opened slowly, and he stepped outside, wearing that same old hat, same rough boots, and that same strong way of standing like the land belonged to him. She felt her breath stop for a moment, not because he looked different, but because he looked exactly the same. He seemed older, only in experience, not in spirit. She wanted to call his name, but her voice refused to rise. He looked out toward the ridge as if he sensed someone was near. She pressed behind a tree, trying not to make sound. She wondered if this moment would lead her into a new life or break. Her heart before she even knocked, she finally stepped out and took one small breath, ready to call to him, but her voice stayed trapped again when she noticed something else that shocked her more than the sight of him. A second horse stood tied near the cabin, saddled and recently ridden, not belonging to him from long ago. She froze there, unable to take one more step, unsure if fate was finally opening her door or slamming it without mercy. She stood still, barely breathing while her thoughts raced faster than any horse she had ever seen. The second horse near the cabin carried a different saddle blanket. It's made with soft colors and fine stitching, the kind usually used when someone cared enough to ride with comfort and pride. She could not see any mark on it that showed who it belonged to, yet the saddle spoke louder than any words. A new life, a visitor, a partner, or something much deeper might already be part of his world. Her fingers curled around the thin branch beside her, and she thought of turning back before he noticed. But the long journey she took and the promise she held inside forced her feet to stay planted. Her heart felt heavy, but she raised her chin slightly, reminding herself she did not come to claim him, only to thank him and give her truth. Whether she stayed longer or left after one conversation would depend on what she discovered in this ridge. He walked toward the horses slowly, checking their straps, and motioned his hand across their backs like someone making sure they were calm and cared for. She could not tell anything from his expression. His face remained steady, carved from patience and understanding like all real cowboys she had known. A small gust of wind rushed past her coat, moving a branch that scraped lightly against her sleeve. The sound made him pause and turn his head toward the trees. He stared directly at the place where she hid, not with fear, but with quiet curiosity. She knew she could not stand there any longer without seeming like an intruder. So she stepped out slowly, trying to keep her voice soft and steady. He watched her face for a moment, and she saw surprise, confusion, maybe even recognition forming deep in his eyes. She took a few small steps forward, clutching her travel bag against her chest. Her voice cracked a little as she greeted him and reminded him who she was. His stare softened for a brief second, and she could see that somewhere inside his memory her younger face still existed. He did not rush forward or speak with loud joy, but he nodded and allowed her to approach. She remembered how quiet he had always been, how he believed actions showed more truth than loud statements. He asked if she needed water or rest from the long road, the same way he had spoken years ago by the fire. The feeling of familiarity wrapped around her like a warm coat. She accepted his offer and followed him toward the cabin slowly, trying not to stare again at the second horse. The cabin door opened with that same wooden sound she remembered from the night. She almost died. Inside, nothing seemed decorated with fancy items, yet everything looked clean, cared for, and placed with understanding. The cabin smelled like pine, leather, and coffee, mixed with light smoke. The table was built from thick wood. The hearth carried burning logs and blankets hung neatly at the back wall. It felt like stepping into a memory she had never truly left. He poured water into a tin cup and set it in front of her. She thanked him and took a long drink, letting her body relax after the journey. Though her mind stayed alert, he sat across from her, eyes steady and calm, waiting for her to speak. She explained why she had returned, making sure her words were honest and simple. She told him her life took her far away, but she always remembered what he did and the courage he showed. She said she wanted to see him again not because of debt or duty, but because she wanted to face the truth of her own heart. He listened without interruption, his hands resting loosely on the table. As if each word she spoke weighed something important, he asked if she found peace in the life she built away from these mountains. She paused before answering because peace was a word she could not claim easily. She had learned skills, gained money, and moved in better circles, but nothing in that world felt rooted. She realized she wanted a life built with meaning, hard work, family, and loyalty, not just comfort and shiny goals. She admitted she never forgot how he held the fire steady for her survival. She said she came back because she wanted to give something of value, not just walk away like a stranger. He looked into the fire for a moment, thinking without rushing. She could feel he was not the type to give fast answers. Her heart pounded, waiting for any sign that she might still fit into his world. Then he raised his eyes and spoke slowly about how life in the West was not simple, and how the land demanded strength, patience, and sacrifice. He told her he never expected to see her again and had learned long ago not to wait for things he could not be sure of. His words were not cold, but they held realism and caution. Like a man who survived storms without leaning on hope too easily. She nodded, knowing she needed to prove her presence was not only emotional but real. She offered to help with daily ranch work so she could stay nearby for some days. She asked if he could allow her time to show who she truly became. He did not deny her request, but his answer came with careful boundaries. He said she could stay for a short while, but only if she respected the land, the rules, the truth that nothing was guaranteed. She accepted without hesitation, willing to prove that she was ready. Before she could settle her feelings, the cabin door pushed open slowly, and she turned to see a young boy standing there, holding a small basket of herbs and firewood pieces. He looked no older than 10 summers, with hair the color of early wheat and eyes sharp like mountain water. Her heart jumped, and the question formed without her permission. She looked at the cowboy, waiting for an explanation. The man placed his hand on the boy's shoulder gently, saying he was a child from a nearby homestead who came there almost every morning to exchange herbs for warm food or supplies. Since his family struggled after a harsh winter, the boy nodded politely, then stared at her with curiosity that had no fear. Her breath eased slowly as she realized she had assumed something far more personal. The boy set his basket on the counter and began arranging the herbs near the fire. He hummed a small song while he worked, and she watched his movements with understanding. Seeing how children in the West grew fast with responsibility, the cowboy stepped aside to help him, and she felt a small, warm ache growing in her chest. She imagined how different this life truly was compared to polished city ways. There was no room for selfish pride in places like this. Here, community, land, and loyalty mattered more than appearance. When the boy finished his task, he thanked the cowboy and gave a shy nod toward her before stepping out again. She felt the heavy unknown return the moment the door closed. The second horse, the small boy, and the quiet tone still left more questions than answers. She decided not to ask anything about the other saddle yet, knowing respect required patience. Later that day, she followed him outside and learned how to chop wood, carry hay, and check fence posts. Her boots became covered in dust, her hands rough with work, yet she felt more alive than she had in years. He watched her silently, maybe surprised that she did not complain or retreat. She hoped each action built something between them, even if small. As the sun lowered behind the mountains, shadows reached across the land. The sky turned orange, and a cold breeze rolled down from the higher ridges. The cowboy finally spoke again, telling her that one more truth needed to be revealed before she built future hopes in her heart. His tone carried a weight she was not ready for, but she had no choice but to listen. He turned his gaze toward the same second horse tied near the fence and said there was someone she needed to meet. Someone who had changed his life in recent seasons. Her stomach tightened, her breath held, and her heart felt frozen as she wondered whether she came back too late or whether destiny was preparing something she never even thought could be part of her story. Her breath grew unsteady, and she tried to prepare her heart for anything that might follow. He walked past her without giving full detail and untied the second horse slowly, brushing dust from its mane like he had done it many times before. His silence felt heavier than spoken words, almost like he was deciding how much truth he should reveal and how soon her heart could bear it. She wanted to ask directly, but something inside reminded her that rushing answers in the West often created wounds harder to heal. She stood quietly until he finally motioned that she should follow him. Not toward the cabin, but toward a narrow trail heading down the ridge. The trail bent between pine trees and tall rock walls, leading to a small meadow that looked hidden from the world. Wildflowers danced against the wind, and there were hoof prints in the soil that showed the path had been used often. As they walked, she tried to read his expression, hoping to find some sign that her return held meaning. Yet his eyes were guarded, steady, and focused on the trail ahead. When they reached a small open area, he stopped and rested his hand on the horse's neck. He spoke in a slow voice, telling her that a person had entered his life not long ago and needed care, guidance, and protection. He explained that this land, these horses, and his cabin were no longer just for him. There were responsibilities he could not ignore, promises he could not break, and choices he could not take lightly. She felt her heart twist, but she held her voice steady and asked softly who that person was. He looked toward the far end of the meadow where a small wooden shed stood near a tree line. The door opened, and a young woman stepped out holding a wool blanket she had been dusting. Her dress was worn, her hair tied back, and her posture carried both tiredness and pride. She paused when she saw visitors and held the blanket against her chest, as if she was unsure whether to approach or stay back. The cowboy told her it was all right and motioned for her to come closer. She walked toward them slowly and offered a small, polite greeting, her eyes curious but cautious. The woman who returned to marry the cowboy felt her heart sink lower, but tried to hide reaction behind calm words. She introduced herself gently and asked how long the woman had been staying there. The young woman explained that she came from a distant settlement after losing her family during a severe winter sickness. The cowboy was the only one who offered help without asking for anything in return. She said she helped around the cabin in exchange for food, shelter, and safety, and she was still trying to find her purpose and strength again. Her voice sounded honest, humble, and full of quiet gratitude. There was no sign of ownership, no sign of bold claim. Yet the unknown between them created a silent pressure in the air. The cowboy stepped back slightly, allowing both women to speak, as if he wanted them to understand each other without his influence. The returning woman asked if she planned to stay forever, but the young woman responded that she did not know what future waited because she still felt lost, unsure of where she belonged or what life wanted from her. She said she owed him more than words could repay, but she also did not want to hold him back from any dream he might carry. These words hit the heart of the returning woman in a complicated way, because she understood the feeling of being saved. But she had come with intentions shaped by time, hope, and memory. They walked back toward the cabin with quiet steps, each carrying thoughts that twisted deeper. The cowboy handed the young woman the blanket again and told her she could continue her work. While he guided the visitor back toward the porch, the air felt thick with questions, but instead of giving answers, he spoke about land seasons, storms, and how life in the West changed without warning. He said people came and left, sometimes by choice and sometimes by fate. He did not speak about love or promises, and that silence hurt more than any spoken refusal. As evening approached, the clouds stretched long across the sky, and the wind carried a colder bite. When the lantern inside the cabin glowed, the three of them shared a simple meal. The young woman prepared stew, the cowboy cut bread, the visitor poured water into cups, trying to show she was not there to be served. She caught the cowboy watching her hands with a thoughtful expression, as if he was watching to see if she was truly capable of fitting into the rhythm of ranch life, rather than only remembering it for heroic memory. Every gesture felt like a quiet test, not forced by him, but shaped by the land itself. After the meal, the young woman stepped outside to bring in more wood, and the visitor decided to help her. The moment they were alone, the air between them held a different kind of tension. Not unfriendly, but layered with curiosity and unspoken fears. The young woman asked quietly why she had returned after so many years. The visitor explained that she had grown up believing she would never be strong enough to return until she became her own person. She said she came back with hope, not claim, and wanted to see if the cowboy could ever see her as someone who chose him freely. The young woman listened without judgment and nodded slowly, admitting she also did not want to stand in someone else's destined place. If it was meant to be filled by another heart, they returned inside. And the cowboy noticed a different calm in both their faces, though nothing had been solved. Later that night, when the young woman went to sleep in a separate shed near the cabin, the cowboy and visitor remained by the fire. The room glowed orange, and their shadows moved slowly on the wooden walls. She gathered courage and asked if her return had changed anything for him. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he asked if she would still stay, even if the truth she hoped for was not the one waiting for her. She looked into the fire, knowing there was risk in staying, but she agreed because she did not want to live with unanswered questions. The next morning, ranch work continued with early dawn. Coyotes howled in the distant hills, horses snorted against the wind, and frost covered the edges of the grass. She learned how to mend rope and carry buckets to the creek, though her hands trembled from cold and inexperience. The cowboy watched quietly, sometimes correcting her grip, sometimes allowing her to learn by mistake. Meanwhile, the young woman tended the herb garden near the shed, humming lightly as birds perched on the fence. Later, a neighbor rode up the trail carrying news that someone from town had been asking about the cowboy recently. He did not know details, only that the sheriff mentioned someone might be riding toward the ridge soon. This news stretched new tension through the air because the cowboy rarely received visitors, except for trade or help. The visitor felt worry settle into her chest, wondering if the person seeking him might be tied to the second horse or something unknown pressing from his past. The young woman lowered her eyes, her hands tightened slightly on her skirt, as if she knew more than she wanted to speak. The cowboy dismissed the neighbor with thanks, but his face stayed tightened with private thought. The visitor noticed how his jaw clenched and his eyes narrowed, something he had not shown earlier. She wanted to ask what burden he carried, but she feared pushing too hard might make him close himself even more. Instead, she worked quietly until afternoon, hoping he would share truth when ready. Finally, when the sun began to drop, he spoke with heavy tone, saying not all wounds show on skin, and not every stranger on horseback comes with kindness. He looked toward the second horse again, then toward the trail leading down the mountain, and said they should prepare for whoever was coming. Because sometimes a quiet life invites storms it never asked for. The visitor felt her heart tighten again, realizing that her journey back had only opened the first door. She had not just returned to love, she had returned to face everything that had shaped him, everything that had broken him, and everything that might still threaten the world she hoped to join. And nothing at that moment could guarantee that she would be strong enough to stand through it. The visitor tried to steady herself as the late afternoon sky turned a deeper shade of red, reminding her that darkness in the west never came alone. It often carried wind, questions, and the kind of battles a person could not run from. She watched the cowboy gather tools, rope, and supplies while his eyes stayed alert, scanning the ridge and valley below. The young woman near the shed closed her basket of herbs and walked toward them with a tense expression. She asked if something dangerous was coming. The cowboy answered without fear, but without comfort, saying that trouble from the past had a way of finding its path again, even across thick forests and long miles. The visitor felt her heart pound harder, wondering if she returned only to step into something he had been trying to protect others from. The cowboy turned to both women and gave, Instructions on what to do if the unknown riders reached the ridge, before answers could be shared. He told them not to leave the area alone no matter what, and not to wander far, because fear could make people hide in the wrong places. His calm voice made his warning feel even more serious. He said he would be riding out at daybreak to speak with the sheriff and gather clear information. But for now, they needed to prepare in case the visitors did not come with peace. The visitor tried to hide her anxiety, but the young woman noticed and placed a steady hand on her arm, reminding her that the West was made of strong hearts. And she was here because she chose courage, not comfort. That night, the cabin felt different. The fire still burned, but the silence between them carried worry. The cowboy sat at the table, sharpening a small blade, not as a threat, but as a tool he might need. The visitor watched his hands, seeing how they never shook and how years on the land carved patience into his bones. She wanted to speak, to ask if her return made this harder, if she was a burden now instead of comfort. Before she could speak, he looked up and told her not to doubt herself. He said life did not bring things without purpose, and she had arrived at a time when truth needed to be faced, not hidden under the weight of old scars. His words gave her strength, even though she still did not know what storm waited beyond the trees. Later, when they stepped outside for fresh air, the moon lit the ground with pale light, and the trees whispered in the breeze. The cowboy spoke again, slower this time, as if he was revealing something that took years to form. He said no matter who arrived from the past, no decision would be made without fairness. He would not let fear control his life again. He added that the visitor deserved a chance to show who she became, and the young woman deserved a path to build her own future, even if it was somewhere else. The visitor listened and felt a small warmth rise through her chest, not because he made a promise, but because he chose integrity over silence. The next morning, he mounted his horse before the sun touched the grass and said he would return before nightfall. The visitor watched him disappear down the ridge, feeling both pride and fear swirl inside her. She turned toward the chores with the young woman, but her thoughts kept drifting toward the trail he followed. The young woman noticed and said she understood, because waiting for someone you cared about was one of the hardest tasks in the world. The visitor was surprised by her honesty and realized they were not enemies. Only two different hearts touched by the same man's kindness to keep their minds busy. They cared for the horses, sorted dried herbs, and fixed loose planks along the shed. Midday passed, and the wind shifted, carrying a distant sound that made both women freeze. Hoofbeats, slow, heavy, and not just one set. The young woman whispered that it was too early for the cowboy to be returning, and the visitor felt her stomach knot. They stepped behind the cabin, quietly watching the ridge path. 3 riders appeared, dressed in weather-beaten coats, hats pulled low, faces stern. They rode in silence, moving with purpose rather than curiosity. The visitor whispered that they should stay hidden, but the young woman said fear would only make it worse. She believed they should stand where they could be seen, showing they had nothing to hide. The visitor swallowed hard and stepped out with her, keeping a careful distance. The riders slowed, scanning the land. Their leader spoke in a deep voice, asking for the cowboy by name, saying they had business with him. When the visitor asked what kind of business, they stared with cold eyes and said it involved land rights, old disputes, and something valuable that belonged to his family years ago. The visitor felt her throat tighten. She told them he was not there, but would return soon. The leader smirked, saying they could wait, but the way he stared at the cabin made her uneasy. The 3 men dismounted and tied their horses near the fence. The young woman suggested offering water to avoid hostility. They agreed and went inside for a moment, where the visitor trembled and tried to breathe slowly. She realized the danger was not just about love, but about history carved into land, survival, and pride, while they carried water outside. One of the men noticed the second horse and raised his brow, saying it looked familiar. He asked where it came from. The visitor felt her pulse race and explained the cowboy owned it. The man shook his head slowly and said he recognized the markings, because the horse once belonged to someone connected to an old claim that never settled. He added that if the story was true, It changed everything about who had rights on this ridge. The visitor felt the weight of something far larger than emotional hope settle on her shoulders. Hours passed slowly, filled with glances, tension, and unanswered questions. The men kept to themselves, but their presence ruined all peace. The visitor and young woman stayed close, speaking only when needed. As the sun lowered again, footsteps sounded from the trail. The cowboy returned, spotting the horses first, then the men, then both women standing near the porch with stiff expressions. He halted only for a second before riding straight into the conversation. The leader greeted him and spoke with a challenging tone, repeating their claim about land, history, and the horse. The cowboy dismounted calmly, but his eyes hardened. He said the horse had been traded from a traveling merchant and legally belonged to him. The men argued that nothing in this land was clean without proof, and if the horse came from the claim they spoke of, then every piece of land around it might be questioned. The visitor felt her knees weaken as she realized how deep the conflict could run. The cowboy told them he would not make decisions based on accusations and that the sheriff would hear both sides before anything happened. The men agreed, but insisted that until the matter was settled, no major change could happen on the ridge, including new building, new ownership, or future commitments. The visitor did not speak, but their eyes drifted toward her long enough to make the meaning clear. After they left, land felt colder than the night before. The cowboy leaned against the porch rail and closed his eyes briefly, as if fighting memories that hurt more than bullets. When he opened them, the visitor finally asked what the claim meant for his life and why someone would fight so hard for it. He looked toward the mountain, saying the claim belonged to someone whose choices caused pain long ago and that he wanted no part of reopening the wound. But now, others were forcing it back into his world. The young woman asked if leaving would help or make things worse. He said running only fed trouble and staying might be the only way to end it. The visitor felt her heart pull between fear and determination. She knew she had come to offer love, not trouble. Yet fate had placed her into a moment where either her courage would rise or her heart would break. She looked at him in the fading light, silently deciding she would face whatever came next. Even if she did not know what it would cost, the air felt tense for the rest of the evening. But something inside the visitor shifted as she watched the cowboy stand on that porch, steady as a rooted oak tree. He looked tired, yet he did not bend. She realized love in the West was not just about feelings or soft words, but about standing shoulder to shoulder when the wind changed. She took a quiet breath and stepped closer to him, letting him know with her presence that she was not planning to walk away. The young woman stood on the other side, showing the same quiet strength. And for the first time, none of them looked like separate parts of a broken story. They looked like three people understanding the same truth. Life was not a straight path, and hearts were shaped more by storms than sunshine. The cowboy finally spoke, saying he would settle everything in town at sunrise with the sheriff and the riders, not through force, but through truth and proof. He looked at both women and told them they mattered not because of what role they might play in his life, but because they represented kindness, loyalty, and honesty. He said that no real future could begin until old shadows stopped chasing him. The visitor felt tears sting her eyes because she understood he was not just fighting over land but over peace inside his soul. She whispered that she believed in him, no matter what the truth turned out to be. And she was willing to accept every piece of his story, not only the beautiful parts. The young woman nodded too, showing she wanted what was right, not what came easiest. Later that night, rain began to fall lightly, tapping the cabin roof like nature was washing away dust from old memories. The three of them sat together, sharing warm drinks, but no one spoke about fear anymore. Instead, they talked about childhood memories, simple dreams, and the value of honest work. For the first time, they smiled, not because the problem was solved, but because hope had found its way between them. When they went to rest, the land felt calmer. The visitor lay awake for a long time, thinking about how life had taken her in long circles only to bring her back to a place that felt like truth. She realized that love was not about saving someone once, but showing up again when fate tested everything. The next morning, they rode into town together. The sky was clear, and the mountains held a soft glow as if they were watching over the moment. When they reached the sheriff's office, the riders were already waiting, standing beside their horses with unreadable expressions. The sheriff welcomed everyone inside, and the cowboy laid out his side of the story, calm and confident. He explained exactly how he obtained the horse many months earlier through trade, supported by witnesses from different areas who had seen the exchange. The sheriff listened carefully, asked questions, and checked written notes from past trade agreements. It became clear that the cowboy had acted within law and honesty. Then came the part that surprised everyone. The rider who had claimed the horse belonged to an old family line admitted that his information was incomplete. He said he had heard rumors, but assumed they were true without full proof. The sheriff stated firmly that assumptions could not replace records, and no claim could be placed without verified evidence. The matter was officially closed in favor of the cowboy. The riders offered a respectful nod and apologized for causing trouble. They then turned to leave town and promised not to return with unfounded claims. When the cowboy stepped outside, the visitor felt her breath release like a weight had lifted from her chest. The young woman also smiled with relief, and the town breeze felt lighter. But the most meaningful part happened when the cowboy turned toward the two women instead of celebrating alone. He said life sometimes tested people not to break them, but to show what truly mattered. He thanked both women for their courage and loyalty. The young woman's eyes filled with emotion as she explained that she now felt strong enough to choose a new path. She said she wanted to travel to another settlement where she could work as an herbal helper and possibly start a small trade of her own. She hugged the cowboy with deep respect and thanked the visitor for treating her like a human being, not like a rival. They promised to stay connected through riders and travelers. After she left with a light heart, silence fell between the visitor and the cowboy, not uncomfortable but filled with meaning. He took a slow breath and said he wanted to speak his truth. He told her he remembered every detail of the night he saved her, even though he never expected her return. He explained that he never chose to love loudly because he believed love should give space, not control. He also admitted that when she returned, he feared she would leave again once life became difficult. She stepped closer and placed her hand on his, telling him she did not come for the easy path. She came because she wanted to share the real life that shaped him. She said she was ready to build something with slow steps, honest effort, and shared decisions. He looked straight into her eyes, and for the first time, he let emotion show without hiding it. He told her he wanted a life with trust, respect, family, and shared dreams. Then he asked if she wanted to stay on the land, not as someone who owed him something from the past, but as someone who chose him freely in the present. Her answer came with steady voice and warm tears. She said yes because she felt at home in his world, and because her heart had not found peace anywhere else. He smiled in a gentle, real way, and the moment felt like the land itself approved. Days turned into weeks as they worked side by side, mending fences, caring for horses, planting small gardens, and making plans for a cabin extension. Their connection grew not only through feelings, but through actions. They laughed more often, shared sunrise coffee, and spoke about a wedding that would not be filled with flashy guests, but with real neighbors who understood the meaning of loyalty. When the wedding day came, it took place on the ridge where the journey had begun. The sun shone bright, horses grazed nearby, and a small group gathered with simple smiles. The cowboy stood tall in clean boots and a neat hat. She wore a modest dress stitched by settlers who believed in love that came from the heart. They exchanged vows with clear voices, promising to hold each other not only in calm seasons, but also when the storms returned. Their kiss was gentle, honest, and filled with the promise of a shared life rather than a fairy tale. Their cabin became a place of welcome for travelers, children without guidance, and neighbors who needed help. She started teaching sewing and reading to young girls, reminding them that strength could grow next to kindness. He continued raising horses and training young cowboys who needed guidance and more than rope and saddle. Their love story became known in nearby towns as a Western love based not on sudden romance but on courage, respect, and destiny. Each night, as they sat by the fire, they thanked life for bringing them through hardship, because without hardship, they never would have learned who they truly were. And so, in the heart of the wide Western land, with mountains watching like old guardians and winds whispering through tall grass. Two souls built a future not because fate demanded it, but because they chose it together. Their love did not shine like gold. It stood like oak, steady, patient, and true.